Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, the newest article in a long line of genre pieces about how hard it is to be a conservative in college these days just dropped. Yesterday, the New York Times published an op-ed by Princeton senior Adam Hoffman titled, "My Liberal Campus is Pushing Free Thinkers to the Right." The argument will sound familiar to all those who've read this genre. In the Before Times, Hoffman argues, politics were mostly separable from personal relationships. Conservatives of old had real opportunities to make their case and have their ideas respectfully challenged in the public square, he wrote. They admired Reagan and the status quo and appreciated university as a, quote, moderating finishing school. But today, campus conservatives are less moderate and more scorched earth. As an example of these extremist conservatives, he links to an article by a Stanford student who has been arguing that Stanford should lose its accreditation because the speech culture is too repressive. And I'd agree with Hoffman that trying to shut down an entire school, along with any and all speech that might happen on campus, is quite extreme and frankly the opposite of the stated goals of these free thinkers. But Hoffman spends no time interrogating that particular conservative hypocrisy. Rather, he pivots to laying the blame for said extremism at the feet of progressive students. He argues that, quote, puritanically progressive campuses alienate conservative students from their liberal peers in college as a whole. The anti-authoritarian, protest-driven disobedience endemic to the left has infected the right and made it worse off. In his words, universities that once served as moderating finishing schools have become breeding grounds for conservative firebrands. Now, of all the things I think college should be, I confess that finishing school is not one that springs to mind. If you want to learn what fork goes with the fish course and how to fit a cummerbund, there are places for that, like maybe cotillions. But it seems to me to be a waste of $60,000 a year in a very capable brain. Seeing college as a finishing school strikes me as much more of a waste than the apocryphal basket-weaving degrees to which conservatives so frequently allude. But there is something fitting in this kind of admission from a Princeton senior and medieval studies major, that he sees college and seemingly the people in it as tools in service of his personal refinement, rather than his education. You see, education, or learning, is often an uncomfortable experience. Sometimes learning means filling a knowledge void, a space where nothing exists. But often, at least for thoughtful students, it means displacing some formerly held belief in a process that can be discomforting. For me, those types of challenges were exactly why I cherished college and chose to go on to law school, where debate and an ability to defend your beliefs were a crucial part of the experience, as, by the way, was the ability to defend beliefs that you didn't actually hold. It wasn't always easy, to be honest. In school, I was called a communist, and not as a compliment. I've been asked to debate whether Black people were intellectually inferior to whites and whether I deserved my place in law school at all. I debated with a student who argued that white people should be compensated when neighborhoods become integrated because the mere presence of Black people brings down housing values. And in a public policy class, a student once opined as to whether Black people were inclined toward crime because apparently our parents raise us to admire crooks when we're watching movies rather than heroes or cops. During one exam season, one of my fellow students made national news headlines when an email she wrote to a fellow white classmate was leaked, in which she opined that, quote, it is at least possible that African Americans are less intelligent on a genetic level, and that she didn't mean to shy away from that opinion at dinner. Now, none of these students were censored, nor should they have been. And with the exception of Stephanie Grace, who wrote that leaked email, none of these conversations carried on beyond the classroom, to my knowledge. Stephanie Grace graduated that year and went on to complete a very prestigious Ninth Circuit clerkship, and the mini scandal had no effect on her career. These moments made law school at times unpleasant for me, but I didn't take to the pages of the New York Times to complain, and I suspect they wouldn't have been especially interested in my kvetching had I tried. But ironically, although Hoffman complains about the popularity of terms like microaggression and trigger warning, wrongly attributing, by the way, those terms which were around before I was in school to Gen Z's arrival on campus, It's hard to identify why Hoffman's own sensitivities, which drew him to air his grievances in the nation's most esteemed daily paper, are less contemptible or speech-suppressing than the student of color he describes in his article, who argued in class that colorblind ideology makes him feel unseen. Was Hoffman unable, intellectually or emotionally, to respond to the student who simply made an argument, which was their right, using their speech rights? Was Hoffman kicked out of class or docked a grade or told to be quiet by his teacher? If so, by all means, I am on Hoffman's side. But if he was simply confronted with an argument, a counter-argument, an opinion that cast his own views in an unfavorable light, I'm inclined to think that maybe he needs to be made of sterner stuff. College is not a finishing school. It's a place where you learn to engage with your community in dynamic and productive ways. Sometimes that is difficult. I don't want to be flippant about that. It is difficult to confront a student who is arguing that your opinion is invalidating or even racist. I know, because almost every day I have to argue with people who characterize, say, my critique of the Israel lobby as anti-Semitic, or even call me racist for my critique of identity politics. Former MSNBC host Tiffany Cross once referred to me as Clayton Bigsby, a black white supremacist character. But what I learned in school, and what I hope Hoffman learns in the brief time he has left before graduation, is the confidence to trust in one's own opinion, your own arguments, your own ethics, and your own morals. And if that confidence falters, to have the humility to ask important questions like, might I be wrong? And might this be one of those learning moments that college is truly about? Now, while Hoffman is concerned with whether one of the most elite universities in the world is sufficiently accommodating to his worldview, it's worth noting what else is going on in American schools. Christopher Rufo, the man who turned CRT, a little-known law school theory, into a core conservative political priority, has been appointed to the new College of Florida board by Governor Ron DeSantis. Now, how does Rufo plan to expand free thought? Well, last week he tweeted that he planned to shut down low-performing, ideologically captured academic departments and hire new faculty, presumably faculty that believes what Rufo believes, and which offers no pesky dissent, aka something I like to call ideological diversity. Rufo went on to write that the student body will be recomposed over time. Some current students will self-select out, others will graduate, will recruit new students who are mission-aligned. So while Princeton should be credited for recruiting and matriculating young Hoffman on at least one conservative campus, a board member is openly announcing his intent to make the atmosphere so toxic that students leave, and to end entire academic departments, and to change admission standards so that only students that are, quote, mission-aligned, aka students that agree with Rufo, are even admitted. Now, at my liberal institution of higher learning, I took classes from conservative professors, and I enjoyed them. I went to law school and took classes that I knew would challenge my beliefs because they would challenge my beliefs. I graduated and I went to work for a federal judge who was conservative and a Bush appointee. I chose a profession in which I have the privilege of sitting next to someone every day with whom I have substantive disagreements, but whom I also respect and learn from. Rufo doesn't want that for his students, and I'm afraid Hoffman, due to maybe critical reasoning skills that might not reflect well on the education he's had so far, doesn't see the difference between the open authoritarianism of Rufo and the organic culture shifts that have tended toward cultural liberalism. To be clear, there are some overreaches on the left. DEI has been a pernicious influence that has focused on these weird linguistic fights instead of discussions about substantive justice for all people. Hoffman could have written about those overreaches, but he didn't. Instead, he wrote a piece that seeks to blame the left for the openly authoritarian right-wing impulses that are infecting his own conservative political cohort. It's Rufo, not Robin DiAngelo, that is making conservatives fringe. And that's not to say there aren't critiques of DiAngelo in her book, Right Fragility to be Had. I have made them. But in this case, the call is coming from inside the House. And I hope instead of appealing to liberals in the New York Times, to be nicer to him that Hoffman matures, learns to make a strong case for his own beliefs, and considers doing the hard work of addressing some of the overreaches within his own political cohort, the way I have consistently done within my own.
So sure, if it's, complaining about I expressed my opinion and then I got pushback on my opinion, there is a category of people, and I don't know, I didn't read the op-ed close enough to know if that's exactly what he was saying, but I understand how people can respond and they go, okay, well, you're almost complaining about free speech. You're expressing your free speech and then you're getting feedback. You don't like it? Sorry, that's part of free speech. I looked at the op-ed, and I see that he is complaining about something I've complained about as well that I think does violate free speech. These actual bias reporting systems, Stanford has one, I just clicked onto it, the report an incident, the protected identity harm reporting process. So it's not just you say something and then you get a response to that the way it's supposed to be, but you could say something and then you could have it secretly reported to a kind of campus police system that might put you through a formal adjudication procedure that will lack fundamental due process and will not be. And this is not unique to Stanford. This happens. There's one of these on hundreds of campuses around the country. They're very bad ideas. It sounds like you agree that they're bad ideas.
Yeah, I think that would be a really interesting thing to write an article about.
Yeah.
But regretfully, Hoffman did not write an article about that. The one example that he gave, as I recall it, was this example of having a discussion in class where he was talking about espousing a colorblind ideology, and a student responding that he felt that was invalidating. I think that's the word that the other student used. Now, I'm familiar with these kind of conversations. I also believe that a certain kind of colorblind ideology that says, hey, Briahna, I didn't even notice that you're black, is absurd. It's facially absurd. We all interact with people. When I walk into a room with you, Robbie, I know that you're a man. I know that you're wearing a suit. We all take in context clues. We're not blind. It's right there in the name, colorblind. It's silly. And for a student to say, I find that to be invalidating, I find that to be a weird kind of erasure, I find that to be a sublimation of reality, I think is a perfectly legitimate response. He might also say, or I don't know what the student, how they it, might also say, I find that that's almost racist because it's such an invalidation, and you can agree or disagree with that. But it's incumbent on you to make that argument. And I don't want to trivialize it. It is hard when you have the minority position in the world, in your social context, in your school, to defend yourself and to have to always be in arguments. I had a very close friend in college who was one of the few Republicans in the middle of the Bush era, and he remains a very close friend of mine to this day. He grew up, clerked for Alito. I mean, he's a very conservative guy. And I love him. Like, we're very close friends. And I witnessed the struggles that he had in college. There were times that we had fights and had a little bit of a blow up during the during the 2008 campaign. But he is one of the smartest people I know and one of the best debaters that I know, precisely because he got into that environment and he made a case for himself. And the debates that we had over the course of college made me a better debater and more able to articulate my views and defend my positions. And so I think Hoffman has a real opportunity here. I agree with you that there shouldn't be secret pogroms to get him off campus, and that he shouldn't suffer, like I said on my radar, he shouldn't suffer any academic or any kind of concrete pressure to not say what he believes. That would be wrong. And the second he writes an op-ed saying that that's what's happened to him, I will do another radar defending that position.
I wonder if the student experience, I'm now, far enough removed from the campus environment. I was just realizing it's 20 years since I was in high school. That I'm not sure if there's still, he references in that op-ed microaggressions, trigger warnings. There's been so much great research done on trigger warnings in the last 10 years and how they're bad and how they actually make people more alarmed if you
more triggered?
Yeah. Well, when you prepare someone, this was what the research was showing. I mean, actually, they studied them, they used them, and the students were like more alarmed and more afraid of the concept you were introducing than if you had just introduced it. There were a couple studies. There's been numerous findings on this. So I would like to see that they're being phased out, just in keeping with the science on trigger warnings. I don't know if that's happening.
I have to think about that. I mean, I do remember in law school in particular, you get into some really, really thorny topics. Everyone's required to take criminal law. You're talking about rape and sexual assault in a very explicit, graphic way. And I remember not realizing at the time, but having conversations with some women in my class afterward, how affecting it was for them. And, you know, I'm sensitive to the idea that they are, at least for those class sessions, perhaps less willing, more uncomfortable participating than other members of the class. And if there's a way to make that a more comfortable experience, I'm open to that. I want everyone to be able to kind of come to these conversations with an equal playing field. However, I'm also very open to the idea that simply saying trigger warning isn't necessarily the best way to go about it, and that sometimes the vulnerabilities that you bring to the classroom are just that. The same way that Hoffman has to deal with the fact that he has a conservative position sometimes. If you've been through a trauma, and you choose to go to law school and engage, like at a certain point, it's difficult to get around this kind of stuff.
Yeah, because you're going to have to handle it as an attorney, just as if you were going to medical school and if you're squeamish about blood or something, you're going to have to work past that to be successful in the field. There have been op-eds from law professors, very famous law professors, expressing concern that they've heard from colleagues that they're actually they're moving away from even teaching aspects of the law as it pertains to sexual assault because of the fear that there will be not just students complaining or students uncomfortable, but students actually filing grievances with Title IX, that there have to be investigations, which I think would be a terrible setback for actually grappling with sexual assault.
I will say that there's one thing is having a conversation about it. There were also lessons that got to a place where the kids started like joking about like hypotheticals of, okay, so if I drag a girl behind the dumpster or rape her for 15 minutes, like it got there. There's a way that I still think a professor has a responsibility to make sure the classroom discussion is professional and sensitive, without, in a way that, doesn't undermine the ability to teach the fundamental lessons. So I do think that there's a there, but it's difficult.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
And the colleges should hire competent professors who are able to navigate those waters successfully and not, if you leave it to the DEI bureaucracy,
100%.
they're going to reach a not necessarily education-enhancing objective.
Yeah.
All right, we'll have more Rising right after this. Please stay with us.